Settle in, friend. Tonight we open the crackling pages of a frontier winter journal, handwritten by Anna May Anderson Larsen, a young Swedish homesteader who faced 6-month darkness, frozen water buckets, and a silence so deep she could hear the cabin timbers breathe. This isn't fiction. These are real survival notes, love, loss, and a quiet mystery. A silver amulet later found on her land where snow still refuses to settle. Let the wind stay outside. Imagine the glow of a small fire, the soft scrape of kindling, the hush between heartbeats. This is a story of endurance made gentle by reflection, a warm pocket of humanity inside a killing cold. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight, and is it winter or summer where you are? Drop it in the comments, then exhale, and lean into the snowlit stillness. Good night, and let's begin. The Winter Journals of Anna May Larsen, a frontier memoir from the personal papers of Anna May Anderson Larsen, 1848-1915, Part 1, The Education of Winter. From my personal journal begun December 1868, tonight, as I sit by my small fire in this cabin I built with these calloused hands, I must write down what I have learned about winter. Not the gentle winter of my childhood in Sweden, but this American winter, this 6-month trial that tests whether human determination can outlast nature's most brutal examination. I write by candlelight, precious though it is, because I need to remember. Not just for myself, but for anyone who might follow this path I have taken. Someone should record what it means to wake each morning to darkness so complete it seems to press against your very soul, to hear the timber of your home crack and sigh as frost tightens its grip on every nail and board. My name is Anna May Anderson, though I suppose it will be Larsen soon enough, if Eric's intentions prove as steady as his character. But that story belongs to later pages. Tonight I write of survival, of the daily negotiations between human need and nature's indifference that have become the rhythm of my existence since I claimed my 160 acres of wilderness, 40 miles north of Lake Superior. When I first arrived in Duluth that autumn day in 1868, stepping off the boat with everything I owned in a single leather satchel, I thought I understood hardship. I had worked in the textile mills of Sweden, saved every penny for 2 years to earn the $10 that would buy me a homestead claim. I had buried my parents, left behind every familiar face, crossed an ocean to reach this land of promised opportunity. I was 20 years old and believed my youth and determination would be sufficient armor against whatever challenges America might offer. How naive that young woman seems to me now, as I write these words with fingers that have learned to split kindling and chink gaps between logs, to coax fire from reluctant embers and break ice thick enough to walk upon. That first winter taught me that survival is not a matter of grand gestures or heroic endurance, but of countless small victories accumulated day by day. Each morning I wake to the sound of timber contracting in the cold, sharp cracks that echo through my one-room home like rifle shots. The air hangs thick and visible. Each breath I take creates a small cloud that dissipates slowly in the still air above my face. Beneath my collection of threadbare quilts, some sewn from old flour sacks, others pieced together from worn clothing, my body creates a small pocket of warmth. But beyond this cocoon, the cold waits with infinite patience. I know without looking that frost has painted intricate patterns across my single window. Delicate ferns and spirals of ice grow overnight on the glass, transforming my view of the world into abstract artwork of winter's making. The beauty is undeniable, but it speaks of temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. My education begins each dawn with this moment of reckoning, the decision to leave the temporary safety of my bed and face what winter has brought to my doorstep while I slept. My feet find the floorboards, and the wood seems to steal warmth directly from my soul. Each step sends a small shock of cold up through my bones. The planks beneath me have contracted overnight, creating tiny gaps that allow wisps of frigid air to seep up from the crawl space below. I have learned to walk quickly, minimizing contact between flesh and these unforgiving surfaces. The hearth draws my attention with the urgency of survival itself. What had been a bed of glowing coals when I banked the fire before sleep has now diminished to a collection of dull, greyed embers. Some still hold deep orange hearts pulsing faintly like dying stars. Others have gone completely cold, reduced to ash that will provide no warmth for the long day ahead. I approach the fireplace with practiced reverence. This iron and stone altar has become the centre of my existence, the difference between life and the slow, creeping death that waits beyond my walls. Kneeling before it, I begin the morning ritual that has become as automatic as breathing. First, the gentle coaxing. I blow softly on the embers, each breath measured and purposeful. Too little air and the coals will die completely. Too much, and I will scatter the precious heat I am trying to nurture. A faint glow responds to my attention, and I feel a flutter of relief in my chest. Fire lives. I will see another day. Kindling comes next. Thin strips of wood I carved by lamplight during yesterday's brief afternoon. Each piece has been saved, hoarded like currency in an economy where fuel equals life. I place them carefully, creating small pathways for air to flow, building a delicate architecture of combustion. One by one the dry wood catches, and the first real flames of the day begin their dance. Warmth begins to radiate outward. I allow myself a moment of gratitude, but the reprieve is brief. The water buckets near my door have transformed overnight into solid blocks of ice. The surface bears geometric patterns of rapid freezing, radiating lines and crystalline formations that speak of temperatures well below zero. I retrieve the heavy axe from beside the door, its handle worn smooth by countless mornings exactly like this one. The metal head has absorbed the night's cold, and touching it sends a sharp ache through my palm. But the work must be done. I position the bucket and bring the axe down with controlled force, sending spiderweb cracks across the ice's surface. Another blow, and chunks of frozen water scatter across my floor like irregular gemstones. The sound echoes in my small space, a percussion that has become the morning music of winter survival. The chunks of ice scatter across my floor like nature's own currency, each piece representing another victory in the endless negotiation between human need and winter's indifference. I have learned to read the ice like others might read a newspaper. Thick, cloudy formations speak of gradual freezing through a long, cold night. Clear, crystalline structures tell of rapid temperature drops that turned liquid to solid in hours. The patterns reveal secrets about the night's weather that no thermometer could provide. Information crucial for planning the day's activities and assessing the challenges that lie ahead. After breaking the ice, I must heat water for the day's needs. This seemingly simple task requires careful calculation. Too much fuel spent on heating water leaves too little for warmth and cooking. Too little hot water makes washing impossible and limits food preparation options. I have developed a system of priorities. Enough heated water for drinking and basic food preparation comes first. then enough for essential cleaning, and finally, if fuel permits, enough for the luxury of washing one's face and hands in water that doesn't immediately numb the skin. The process of heating water becomes a meditation on efficiency and conservation. I placed the largest pot I own, a cast iron vessel that was among my few purchases in Duluth, directly over the fire's hottest flames. While waiting for the water to heat, I arranged the day's tasks in order of importance and fuel requirement. Nothing can be left to chance when every stick of wood must serve multiple purposes, and every flame must accomplish as much work as possible before it dies. The water, when it finally begins to steam, creates its own small miracle in my cabin. The vapor rises and spreads, adding precious moisture to air so dry it cracks lips and makes breathing uncomfortable. For a few moments, the steam creates the illusion of warmth and comfort, transforming my small space into something approaching cozy rather than merely survivable. But the illusion is brief, and the work continues. My livestock wait in the lean-to shelter I attached to the cabin's north wall. The construction of this shelter, completed during the desperate weeks before my first winter, represents one of my earliest lessons in frontier architecture. Every board, every nail, every joint serves multiple functions. The shared wall between cabin and shelter allows heat to flow between the spaces, creating a modest warming effect for the animals, while using their body heat to help maintain temperature in my living area. The positioning takes advantage of natural windbreaks, while providing protection from the prevailing storms that sweep across the landscape with devastating force. Their proximity serves dual purposes beyond mere convenience. Their body heat helps warm my living space, while the shared wall makes it possible to tend them even in the worst weather. But this morning, even that short journey requires preparation that has become as ritualized and essential as the morning fire building. I wrap myself in layers that have evolved through trial and error into a system of survival. First comes the long woolen underwear that I knitted during the previous winter's long evenings, scratchy against the skin but essential for maintaining core body temperature. Over this, a flannel shirt that was once my father's, the fabric worn soft by years of use, but still sturdy enough to provide warmth without bulk. The coat comes next, sewn from an old blanket that I purchased at a discount in Duluth, its original blue colour now faded to grey, but its wool still capable of trapping air and creating insulation. The construction is simple but effective. Large pockets for carrying essential items, a high collar that can be turned up against wind, sleeves long enough to cover my wrists even when reaching overhead. Mittens follow, knitted from unravelled wool that I collected from discarded garments and carefully cleaned and respun. The design prioritizes warmth over dexterity, thick enough to provide insulation against metal tools that absorb cold, loose enough to allow blood circulation that prevents frostbite, but fitted well enough to maintain grip when handling animals or equipment. Finally, the scarf, a long strip of fabric that wraps around my neck and can be pulled up to cover everything below my eyes when conditions require it. This piece serves multiple functions: wind protection, breath warming, as air passes through the fabric before reaching my lungs, and emergency bandage should accidents occur while working outdoors. Each layer represents hours of work during precious evening time when light was available for detailed tasks. Each stitch was placed with the understanding that poor construction could mean the difference between returning safely to my cabin and freezing to death 20 feet from my door. The door sticks in its frame, wood swollen by moisture that has penetrated the grain and frozen into ice crystals that act like mortar between door and jamb. This daily battle has taught me to approach the task with patience rather than force. I place my shoulder against the door and push steadily, feeling the resistance that speaks of ice formations I cannot see but must overcome through persistent pressure. The trick, learned through experience that included several mornings when panic at being trapped inside nearly overcame reason, is to apply steady force while working the handle up and down, creating movement that breaks ice formations gradually rather than all at once. Too much force applied suddenly can damage hinges or crack the door itself, repairs that would be difficult under the best circumstances and potentially impossible during winter conditions. After several minutes of patient work, I feel the resistance give way suddenly as the door breaks free from its icy seal. The sound, a sharp crack followed by the whisper of ice fragments falling to the ground, has become as familiar as the morning songs of birds were in my childhood in Sweden. The cold hits me like a physical blow, not the gentle chill of a Swedish winter morning, but something altogether more aggressive and demanding. The air is so frigid it seems to have weight and substance, pressing against my exposed skin with sharp insistence that penetrates even through my carefully constructed layers of protection. This is air that could kill, and it makes no pretense of being anything else. My eyes water immediately, an involuntary response to air so cold it shocks the exposed membranes. The tears threaten to freeze on my cheeks before they can fall, creating tiny ice crystals that I can feel forming against my skin. I have learned to squint almost immediately upon stepping outside, protecting my eyes while still maintaining enough vision to navigate safely through the transformed landscape. Each breath burns slightly as the supercooled air travels down my throat and into my lungs, creating a sensation that newcomers to this climate find alarming, but which has become, for me, simply another aspect of winter existence. The key is to breathe through the nose when possible, allowing the nasal passages to warm the air somewhat before it reaches the lungs, and to avoid rapid breathing that could shock the system. I have learned to read my body's responses to these extreme conditions, understanding the difference between discomfort that can be endured and warning signs that demand immediate attention. Tingling in fingers or toes means circulation is being restricted. Time to move more vigorously or seek shelter. Sharp pain in exposed skin suggests the beginning stages of frostbite. Time to cover the affected area immediately. Confusion or unusual drowsiness can signal dangerous drops in core body temperature. Time to return to shelter regardless of uncompleted tasks. The world outside exists in monochrome that would be beautiful if it weren't so potentially deadly. Endless variations of white and grey stretching to a horizon, obscured by low, heavy clouds that promise more snow to come. This is not the cheerful winter landscape of Christmas illustrations, but something more primal and austere, a world reduced to its essential elements of survival and endurance. Snow has drifted against my cabin overnight, wind sculpted into waves and valleys that transform familiar landmarks into alien geography. The mathematics of snow drifting follow rules I have gradually learned to read. Prevailing wind direction, obstacles that create eddies and downdrafts, the difference between powder snow that blows easily and heavier snow that packs and builds into more permanent formations. What was once a clear path to my woodpile is now a series of small dunes, each one hiding potential obstacles beneath its smooth surface. I have learned never to trust the appearance of level snow, as it may conceal anything from small rocks to fallen branches to holes that could trap an unwary foot. Every step must be tested, every surface evaluated for stability and safety. The woodpile itself has been transformed by the night snowfall into an abstract sculpture, individual logs now buried under accumulated snow that must be cleared away before fuel can be retrieved. This daily excavation has become another ritual in the complex choreography of winter survival, requiring tools, time, and energy that must be calculated against the day's other needs. My breath creates a constant cloud around my head as I move through this landscape. The vapor freezes instantly on the wool of my scarf, creating small icicles that click softly as I walk. Every step produces a distinctive sound, the dry squeak of snow compacting under my boots, a sound that only occurs when temperatures drop well below freezing. The livestock shelter houses my small herd of survival. 2 cows with thick winter coats frosted with ice crystals, their patient eyes regarding me with the resignation of creatures who understand endurance. A handful of chickens huddled together on their roosts, feathers fluffed into insulating spheres. The goat, hardy and stubborn, stands defiantly in the corner, seemingly unbothered by conditions that would kill a human in hours. The animal's water containers present the same challenge as those in my cabin. Ice several inches thick has formed overnight, sealing away the liquid beneath. I repeat my axe work, breaking through to the precious water below. The animals gather around the newly opened source, their movements generating small clouds of vapor as their warm breath meets the frigid air. Feeding requires its own careful calculation. Hay from my summer efforts stored in the shelter's upper reaches must be rationed with mathematical precision. Too little, and the animals will weaken, their milk production dropping, their ability to survive the remaining months of winter compromised. Too much, and my supplies will run short before spring's arrival, leading to the same outcome by a different path. Each forkful of hay represents hours of summer labor that now seem like memories from another lifetime. The cutting under the hot sun when such heat felt oppressive rather than precious. The drying in fields where grasshoppers sang their endless songs. The careful storage in quantities that seem generous in August, but feel desperately finite in January's harsh arithmetic of survival. The hay itself tells stories to those who know how to read them. The colour reveals the stage of maturity when it was cut. Green hay retains more nutrients but may have been cut too early, while golden hay suggests perfect timing, and brown hay might indicate cutting that was delayed too long. The smell speaks of storage conditions. Sweet, earthy aromas suggest proper curing and dry storage, while musty odours warn of moisture that could lead to spoilage or mould. I distribute the fodder with practiced economy born of experience that taught harsh lessons about the consequences of miscalculation. Each animal receives a carefully measured portion based on their size, their role in my survival system, and their demonstrated efficiency in converting feed to useful output. The milk cow receives the largest portion because her production provides essential nutrition and trade goods. The chickens get smaller amounts but higher quality hay mixed with whatever grain I can spare. The process requires constant mental arithmetic that would have seemed impossibly complex in my previous life, but has become as automatic as breathing. How much hay remains in storage? How many days until spring brings new grass? How much can each animal receive today while ensuring they all survive until fresh forage becomes available? Too generous now means starvation later. Too stingy now means reduced production that could prove equally fatal. While distributing the hay, I observe each animal with the attention of a physician examining patients. Are they maintaining weight? Do their coats show the thickness that indicates adequate nutrition? Are their movements energetic or lethargic? Do their eyes show alertness or the dullness that suggests declining health? These daily health assessments require no medical training but demand the accumulated wisdom of someone whose survival depends on keeping these creatures alive and productive through conditions that challenge every living thing. A sick animal cannot be easily replaced, and veterinary care is non-existent. Prevention and early intervention represent the only realistic approaches to livestock health management. The morning chores complete, I return to my cabin to begin the day's careful negotiations with survival. But the transition from outdoor work to indoor activities requires its own ritual of adjustment and preparation. The dramatic temperature change, from air cold enough to freeze exposed skin to the relative warmth of my heated cabin, creates physical stresses that must be managed carefully to avoid illness or injury. If I am fortunate in my rationing, breakfast might include flour for pancakes cooked on my wood stove's flat surface. More likely it is a thin gruel made from grain, and whatever preserved meat remains from autumn's preparations. Each meal represents a small victory against the cold and a step closer to spring's distant promise. The rhythm of my days unfolds with the slow predictability of necessity. Wood must be gathered from the pile I built during warmer months, each log now frozen solid, requiring careful selection to ensure pieces that will burn efficiently in my precious fire. The woodpile itself has become a sculptural landscape, individual logs welded together with ice, requiring careful prying to separate fuel from the frozen mass. Water collection involves more than simply breaking ice. The creek that runs behind my property has developed its own winter personality. What was once a babbling stream now flows beneath a thick ice cap, visible only where current has kept small sections from freezing completely. Reaching the water requires chopping through ice that reforms almost as quickly as I can break it, creating a constantly moving target for my efforts. The process of collecting water becomes a meditation on the essential nature of life itself. Each bucketful represents triumph over the elements, liquid proof that life continues even when nature seems determined to reduce everything to frozen stillness. I carry the water back to my cabin quickly, knowing that exposed to the air it will begin forming ice crystals within minutes. Midday brings its own particular challenges. The sun, when visible through the perpetual overcast, traces a low arc across the southern sky, providing light but precious little warmth. Shadows stretch long and blue across the snow, creating a landscape of subtle color variations that would be beautiful if they didn't represent such deadly conditions. This is when I attempt the more complex tasks that winter demands, repairs to equipment that has failed under the stress of extreme cold, maintenance of tools and structures that must function despite conditions that make every material brittle and unforgiving. Metal becomes fragile, leather cracks like dried leaves, rope snaps under loads it would easily handle in warmer weather. Each repair requires working with materials that resist every effort at manipulation, my fingers growing numb within minutes, despite whatever protection my mittens provide. Tool maintenance becomes a constant concern. Metal surfaces develop coats of frost that must be scraped away before use. Wooden handles contract and expand with temperature changes, loosening connections and creating dangerous points of failure. The simple act of chopping wood becomes an exercise in careful attention. A poorly secured axe head could fly free, creating an emergency that might prove fatal in my isolated circumstances. The wind serves as winter's most persistent tormentor. It finds every gap in my cabin's construction, every space between logs that my careful chinking has failed to completely seal. The sound becomes a constant companion, sometimes a low moan that vibrates through the wooden structure, other times a sharp whistle that speaks of air moving at speeds that would knock me down if encountered in the open. During the worst storms, the wind drives snow through gaps I never knew existed. I wake to find small drifts of powder on the floor beneath my windows, evidence of winter's ability to penetrate my most careful defences. These invasions require immediate attention. Snow that melts inside my cabin creates moisture that can freeze again when temperatures drop, potentially damaging my precious shelter from within. Evening arrives with startling suddenness. The sun's brief appearance ends by mid-afternoon, leaving long hours of darkness that must be filled with activities that don't require significant fuel consumption. Candlelight becomes a luxury reserved for essential tasks. Most evening activities occur by the variable light of my fireplace, creating a world of shifting shadows and warm orange illumination that transforms my small cabin into a cave-like refuge. I spend these dark hours on handwork, knitting, sewing, carving, whittling. These activities serve multiple purposes, producing necessary items while keeping my hands busy and my mind occupied during the long hours when each day blends into the next in an endless sequence of survival tasks. The rhythm of such work becomes meditative, repetitive motion that helps mark the passage of time. When I finally prepare for sleep, the rituals begin again. Banking the fire to preserve coals for morning, arranging my bedding to maximize warmth retention, ensuring that essential items remain accessible in case emergency strikes during the night. These midnight preparations become moments of solitary communion with winter's vast presence, times when the full scope of my isolation becomes most apparent. I stand before my dying fire, feeling its warmth on my face while the cold presses against my back. Outside, wind continues its constant conversation with my cabin's wooden walls. Snow whispers against my windows with a sound like distant applause. Somewhere in the darkness, beyond my circle of warmth and light, winter waits with infinite patience. The night sounds of this season differ completely from those of warmer months. No insects buzz. No small animals rustle through undergrowth. No birds call from darkened trees. Instead, I hear the sounds of a world in suspension. The crack of freezing wood, the soft whisper of settling snow, the distant howl of wind across open spaces. Sometimes, if I listen carefully, I might catch the sound of wolves calling to each other across the frozen landscape. Their voices carry differently in the thin, cold air, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The sound reminds me that other forms of life have found ways to thrive in conditions that challenge human survival, that winter belongs to creatures better adapted to its demands. As I finally settle into my bed, pulling quilts and blankets up to my chin, I carry with me the knowledge that tomorrow will bring the same challenges, the same careful balance between conservation and consumption, the same negotiations with cold and darkness and isolation. But I also carry the quiet satisfaction of another day survived, another step closer to spring's eventual return. Each dawn brings the same challenges, but also the same opportunity to prove once again that human determination can outlast even winter's most determined assault. In the moments before sleep, I sometimes allow myself to imagine the sound of running water, the sight of green grass, the feeling of warm air against bare skin. These dreams become fuel for endurance, promises whispered to myself in the darkness that this too shall pass, that winter will end as it always has, and that spring will return with its gifts of warmth and growth, and the simple pleasure of stepping outside without fear. Until then, I endure. I wake each morning to frost on my windows and ice in my buckets. I tend my fire and care for my animals and measure out my provisions with mathematical precision. I survive because survival is what humans do, even when the world around them seems determined to prove that life is too fragile to persist. Part 2. The Making of a Life. From my personal journal, continued through the years 1869, 1881. Spring of 1869 arrived like a resurrection, though I did not use such dramatic words then. I wrote simply, "The creek runs again. The sound is like celebration." But now, looking back across the decades, I understand that those first tentative sounds of moving water represented something approaching the miraculous, proof that the world could return to life after months of apparent death. The season revealed winter's damage with the honesty of melting snow. Sections of chinking had loosened between my cabin logs. Roof areas showed where ice dams had allowed water to penetrate. Fence posts had heaved out of the ground as earth froze and thawed. But the damage seemed manageable, a tuition payment for the education I had received in frontier survival. My second spring in this country brought something I had not dared expect during those long winter nights when loneliness felt as solid and persistent as the cold itself. At the barn raising for Heinrich and Greta Zimmermann, the German family who had established a claim near the crossroads that served our scattered community, I met Erik Larsen. I must pause in my writing to light another candle. The first has burned down to a stub, and I find I need more light to record these particular memories properly. Some stories deserve illumination. Erik was the son of Norwegian immigrants, 26 years old to my 21, with 3 years of homesteading experience that showed not only in the calluses on his hands, but in the way he moved through frontier tasks with an economy of motion that spoke of hard-earned wisdom. His father, Olaf Larsen, had established their homestead in 1866, 2 years before my own arrival, and had died during Erik's second winter, a loss that forced the young man to master in months what most learned over years. The tragedy that made Erik an orphan had also made him remarkably capable. He possessed skills that many frontier men never fully developed. He could shoe a horse, repair complicated machinery, and construct buildings that would withstand the worst weather. More importantly, he had learned to plan and think ahead with the methodical approach that frontier survival demanded. Our meeting occurred not in the romantic circumstances that novels might suggest, but in the practical context of community work. Neighbours gathering to accomplish tasks too large for individual effort. The Zimmermann's barn raising represented one of those essential community cooperatives that made frontier life possible. Heinrich Zimmermann, a German immigrant with engineering knowledge, had designed an ambitious structure that would provide shelter for livestock, storage for feed and equipment, and a workshop area where community members could share tools and expertise. The work began before dawn on a crisp October morning, when the first frost had painted the landscape but the ground remained workable. Men arrived carrying hand tools and expertise. Women brought food for the communal meals that would sustain workers through the long day. Children ran errands and performed small tasks while learning through observation the skills they would need as adults. I arrived with my contribution to the community meal, bread baked in my small oven, and preserves made from wild berries gathered during the brief summer season. But I also brought skills that some might have considered unusual for a woman. I could handle heavy timber, drive nails with accuracy, and work alongside the men when extra hands were needed for tasks that required strength rather than finesse. It was while helping to position one of the massive roof beams that I first worked directly with Eric. The beam, cut from a pine tree that had probably been growing when my grandparents were children, required 6 people to lift it into position. Eric coordinated the effort, his voice calm and clear as he directed our movements with the precision of someone who understood that a mistake could result in serious injury. "Steady now," he called as we maneuvered the timber toward its final position. "Anna May, can you hold your end while I adjust the support?" The casual use of my name, spoken with the slight accent that marked his Norwegian heritage, created an unexpected moment of intimacy in the midst of communal labour. Our eyes met across the length of that heavy beam, and I saw something that made my heart skip. Not just competence or physical strength, but a kindness that seemed all the more valuable because it was offered freely in circumstances where kindness was a luxury few could afford. His hands showed the same scars and roughness that marked my own, evidence of years spent wrestling with the practical demands of frontier existence, but also testament to the careful attention required to survive in an environment that punished carelessness with injury or death. A thin white line across his left palm spoke of an accident with a cutting tool. Calluses at the base of his fingers indicated countless hours gripping axe handles and saw grips. Small burns on his knuckles revealed experience with forge work and hot metal, but these marks of hard labour were balanced by a gentleness in how he used those damaged hands. Careful precision when handling delicate objects, mindful strength when working with animals, subtle consideration when passing tools to others. I found myself watching those hands as we worked, fascinated by the contradiction between their evident toughness and their careful grace. Our initial conversation, conducted in a mixture of English and the Scandinavian languages we shared, began with practical matters but gradually revealed deeper compatibilities. We discussed which varieties of wheat seemed most successful in local soil. He favoured a hardy strain his father had brought from Norway, while I had experimented with varieties recommended by the Swedish families in Duluth. We compared techniques for preserving meat without access to salt. He described a smoking method learned from Ojibwe neighbours, while I shared a drying technique my grandmother had used in Sweden. We explored methods for constructing root cellars that remained frost-free through winter. His family's cellar featured an innovative ventilation system, while mine relied on careful insulation and drainage. But beneath these practical exchanges, I began to recognize something that had been absent from my life since my arrival in America: the possibility of conversation with someone who understood not just the technical challenges of frontier life, but the emotional and intellectual demands as well. Eric had read books, not many, but enough to maintain connection with ideas and perspectives beyond the immediate concerns of survival. He could discuss politics, religion, and philosophy with the thoughtful consideration of someone who had time to think, because he had mastered the practical skills that kept him alive. He asked questions about my experiences in Sweden, my reasons for immigrating, my hopes for the future, with genuine interest rather than mere politeness. Most remarkably, he listened to my answers with attention that suggested he valued my thoughts and experiences as equal to his own. In a frontier community where women's contributions were essential but often unacknowledged, Eric's respect for my capabilities and opinions felt revolutionary. As the barn raising continued through the day, we found ourselves working together on increasingly complex tasks. We developed an unspoken communication system, a nod indicating readiness, a gesture suggesting adjustment, a glance confirming understanding. By afternoon, we were functioning as a team with the smooth coordination that typically required weeks or months to develop. The other community members began to notice our partnership. Heinrich Zimmermann commented approvingly on our efficiency. Greta suggested that we made a good working pair. The children, with the innocent directness of youth, began asking when we were getting married. Questions that brought colour to my cheeks but seemed to amuse rather than embarrass Eric. But beneath these practical exchanges, I recognised something that had been absent from my life since my arrival in America: the possibility of partnership with someone who understood both the challenges and rewards of the life I had chosen. Eric's presence represented not escape from the demands of frontier existence, but the prospect of facing those demands with companionship rather than solitude. Our courtship unfolded with the measured pace that frontier life imposed on all activities, creating a romance built on shared respect and practical cooperation, rather than the passionate intensity described in novels. Visits required planning around weather conditions and work schedules that left little room for spontaneity. The trip between our homesteads consumed half a day each direction, even in good conditions, making casual encounters impossible and rendering each meeting precious by virtue of the effort required to arrange it. Eric's first planned visit to my homestead occurred on a Sunday afternoon in late November, when the first significant snow had fallen, but travel remained possible for someone willing to accept the risks involved. He arrived in mid-afternoon, having started his journey before dawn to allow sufficient daylight for the return trip. The sight of him approaching through the snow-covered landscape, leading his horse to avoid exhausting the animal in difficult conditions, filled me with emotions I had not expected to feel again after leaving my family in Sweden. I had spent the morning preparing for his visit with an attention to detail that revealed how much the occasion meant to me. My cabin, normally kept clean and functional rather than decorative, received special treatment. Floors swept and scrubbed, windows cleaned until they sparkled, furniture arranged to create the most welcoming atmosphere possible within my modest space. I had baked bread using precious white flour saved for special occasions, prepared coffee using beans that represented a significant portion of my limited cash resources, and created a simple meal that would demonstrate both hospitality and competence without appearing to show off resources I didn't possess. Yet when Eric arrived, what impressed him most was not the special preparations, but the fundamental orderliness and efficiency of my homestead operations. He examined my root cellar with professional interest, commenting approvingly on the drainage system and storage methods. He studied my livestock shelter, noting innovations I had developed for winter feeding and watering. He observed my workshop area, where I maintained and repaired tools and equipment with the careful attention that frontier survival required. "You have built something solid here," he said, and his tone carried respect that felt more valuable than any romantic compliment. "This homestead could support a family." The words hung in the air between us, creating an understanding that transcended formal declarations of intent or affection. Our conversations during that first visit covered practical matters that might have seemed unromantic but were essential for two people considering a future together. We discussed our resources, our debts, our plans for expansion and improvement. We shared our experiences with crop failures and successes, with equipment breakdowns and repairs, with the countless small crises that tested frontier resilience. But we also talked about books we had read, ideas we had encountered, dreams we harboured for lives that might extend beyond mere survival. Eric spoke of his desire to establish a more diversified operation that could provide security against crop failures. I shared my hope of creating a home where children could receive education while learning practical skills. The trip between our homesteads consumed half a day each direction, even in good conditions, making regular visits impossible during the worst winter weather. Yet these limitations created an intensity that might not have existed under easier circumstances. Every conversation carried weight because opportunities for communication were limited. Every shared moment felt precious precisely because such moments had to be earned through effort and planning. We exchanged letters during the worst weather, when travel became impossible and communication required creativity and patience. I treasure those few pages still, though the paper has yellowed and Eric's careful handwriting has faded until it requires good light to read. His letters reveal a thoughtful man struggling to express feelings for which frontier life provided little vocabulary or precedent. "Dear Anna May," one letter begins, "the storm that prevents my visit gives me opportunity to write thoughts that face-to-face conversation might not allow. Your kindness during my last visit reminded me that life need not be only about survival, that human companionship can make even the hardest work feel meaningful. I hope you will not think me too forward if I say that I find myself planning future projects with the assumption that you will be there to share both the labour and the satisfaction of accomplishment." My own letters, equally constrained by the formal language that our upbringing had provided, attempted to convey feelings that frontier life had awakened but not prepared me to express. "Dear Eric," I wrote in response, "your letter arrived at a moment when the isolation felt particularly heavy. Reading your words reminded me that I am no longer truly alone, that someone else shares my hopes for what this harsh country might become with sufficient patience and effort. I find great comfort in knowing that you think of our work as shared endeavour rather than parallel struggle. The winter of 1870 brought a blizzard that trapped me in my cabin for 6 days straight. Snow fell with such intensity that visibility dropped to mere feet, making any travel suicidal. When the storm finally passed, Eric arrived at my door, having fought through drifts that reached above his head in places, driven by concern that had overcome caution. The sight of him standing in my doorway, snow-covered and exhausted from his journey, provided me with a revelation about the nature of love in circumstances where survival itself required constant attention. Love, I realized, was not the romantic luxury described in the novels I had read as a girl, but something more fundamental: the willingness to risk one's own safety for another's welfare, the commitment to share both burdens and comforts that frontier life provided in unpredictable measure. We married in the spring of 1871 in the parlour of the Hendersons, the only family in the region wealthy enough to own a piano. The ceremony was conducted by circuit preacher Matthews, who visited the scattered homesteads twice yearly, performing the accumulated sacraments that isolated communities required. I wore a dress sewn from fabric ordered through the mail, the style simplified to accommodate the realities of construction in a one-room cabin with limited light. The celebration that followed was modest by the standards of more settled communities, but it felt like the most elegant affair imaginable to those of us who had spent years measuring every resource against survival needs. Marriage changed the rhythm of my days once again, as Eric and I learned the complex negotiations that partnership required when survival depended on flawless cooperation and mutual trust. The transition from solitary existence to shared life presented challenges that no courtship, however thoughtful, could have fully prepared us to handle. Tasks had to be divided not according to traditional gender roles imported from European traditions, but according to ability, efficiency, and the practical demands of frontier survival. Whoever could best perform a necessary function did so, regardless of social conventions that might have applied in more settled communities. This pragmatic approach to labour division required both of us to abandon preconceptions about appropriate roles and develop new understanding of partnership based on contribution rather than custom. I discovered that Eric possessed skills that complemented my own in ways that made our combined efforts significantly more effective than the sum of our individual capabilities. His experience with metalwork, learned from his father who had trained as a blacksmith in Norway, allowed him to repair tools and construct implements that made our work more efficient and reduced our dependence on expensive manufactured goods that might not be available when needed. He could forge replacement parts for agricultural equipment, create specialized tools for specific tasks, and maintain our implements in working condition, despite the hard use that frontier life demanded. His small forge, constructed during his bachelor years, became one of our homestead's most valuable assets, not just for our own use, but as a service we could provide to neighbors in exchange for labor, materials, or goods we could not produce ourselves. My knowledge of food preservation, learned through trial and error during my solitary years and enhanced by techniques shared by other immigrant families, proved invaluable when applied to the larger quantities that our joint efforts produced. The methods I had developed for preserving vegetables in small batches could be scaled up to handle the increased production that Eric's agricultural skills made possible. We experimented with new preservation techniques, combining Scandinavian methods with approaches learned from German neighbours and indigenous communities. Eric's mechanical aptitude allowed him to construct improved storage facilities, better root cellars, more efficient smoking houses, improved containers for pickled and fermented foods. But the transition to married life required more than just efficient task division. We had to learn to coordinate our work schedules, accommodate each other's preferences and habits, and develop communication systems that would function even under the stress of emergency situations. The small disagreements that might be minor irritations in comfortable circumstances could become serious problems when survival depended on smooth cooperation. I remember one early argument about woodcutting that illustrated the adjustment challenges we faced. Eric preferred to cut firewood in large batches, working intensively for several days to build up substantial reserves. I had developed a routine of cutting smaller amounts daily, maintaining steady supplies without exhausting myself with marathon work sessions. Both approaches had merit, but they were incompatible when applied to shared resources and common tasks. We spent a tense evening discussing the advantages and disadvantages of each method, trying to reach compromise that would satisfy both practical needs and personal preferences. The solution we eventually developed, seasonal variation that used Eric's batch method during good weather and my daily method during challenging conditions, proved more effective than either approach alone. The physical reality of sharing a one-room cabin also required adjustments that tested our patience and adaptability. Privacy, already limited in frontier conditions, became almost non-existent when two adults attempted to maintain personal space within walls that measured only 18 by 24 feet. We had to develop unspoken protocols for personal hygiene, changing clothes, and attending to bodily functions that could maintain dignity while acknowledging practical constraints. Eric constructed a small addition to our cabin during the summer after our marriage. Not a separate room, but an enclosed porch area that provided some additional space for activities that required more room than our main living area could accommodate. The addition also served as a buffer zone between the interior warmth and exterior cold, reducing heat loss and providing storage space for items that needed protection from weather but didn't require full heating. These practical adjustments were balanced by the profound comfort of no longer facing frontier challenges alone. The simple presence of another person, someone to share the work, to provide assistance during emergencies, to offer encouragement during discouraging times, transformed the emotional landscape of frontier existence as dramatically as marriage had changed our daily routines. Our first child arrived in November of 1872, during a week when temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there, creating conditions that transformed childbirth from a natural process into a test of community cooperation and maternal endurance. Astrid's birth began with labour pains that started during a blizzard that made travel dangerous for anyone not facing life or death necessity. Eric rode through conditions that could have killed him to fetch Greta Zimmermann, the German woman who had assisted at several births in our scattered community and represented our best hope for experienced help during delivery. Greta's journey from her homestead to ours, 5 miles across landscape made treacherous by wind-driven snow and temperatures that could freeze exposed skin within minutes, demonstrated the kind of neighbourly courage that made frontier survival possible. She arrived at our cabin exhausted from her struggle through the storm, but immediately took charge of preparations with the calm competence of someone who had faced similar challenges before. Her satchel contained supplies accumulated through years of attending frontier births, clean cloth for swaddling, herbal preparations for pain management, instruments sterilized as thoroughly as frontier conditions allowed. But even Greta's experience could not entirely overcome the challenges of delivering a baby in a one-room cabin, heated only by a wood fire during weather that made every routine task dangerous. Water had to be heated in quantities that strained our fuel supplies. Clean cloths had to be prepared and maintained in conditions where contamination could prove fatal. The cabin had to be kept warm enough for a newborn while conserving fuel that might be needed for days or weeks if the storm continued. The birth itself, lasting nearly 20 hours, tested my endurance in ways that even frontier hardships had not prepared me to handle. Pain that might have been manageable in comfortable circumstances became almost overwhelming when combined with concerns about fuel consumption, food preparation, and the dozen other survival tasks that could not be postponed even for childbirth. Eric maintained the fire, prepared meals, cared for the livestock, and handled countless small tasks that kept our homestead functioning, while I laboured to bring our child into the world. His steady presence provided emotional support that proved as essential as Greta's medical expertise. When Astrid finally emerged, a healthy girl with strong lungs and the robust constitution that frontier children needed to survive, her first cries echoed through our small cabin, like announcements of victory over the hostile forces that seemed determined to prevent new life from establishing itself in this harsh environment. Caring for an infant in a one-room cabin heated only by a wood fire required innovations that no book or family tradition had prepared me to make. Cloth diapers had to be washed and dried in conditions that froze water solid within minutes of exposure to outside air, creating logistical challenges that tested both creativity and patience. I developed a system of rotating clean diapers from a drying area near the fireplace, where they could benefit from radiant heat without risk of catching fire. Soiled diapers were rinsed immediately in water, heated specifically for that purpose, then stored in covered containers until weather permitted more thorough washing. The system required constant attention and consumed significant amounts of fuel, but it maintained sanitary conditions that protected Astrid from infections that could prove fatal. Feeding presented its own challenges. Nursing provided essential nutrition that required no preparation or heating, but my own diet had to be carefully managed to ensure adequate milk production. The preserved foods that had sustained Eric and me through winter were supplemented with whatever fresh resources could be obtained despite weather conditions. Eric hunted when possible, bringing home game that provided protein essential for milk production. Neighbours occasionally shared surplus eggs or milk from cows that were producing despite winter conditions. Every additional source of nutrition represented both immediate benefit and future investment in our child's health. The logistics of infant care created stress that challenged the careful cooperation that survival demanded, but also demonstrated the strength of the partnership Eric and I had developed. We divided night feeding duties, allowing each other essential sleep while ensuring Astrid received constant attention. We coordinated daily tasks around her sleeping and feeding schedule, adapting our work routines to accommodate the demands of parenthood. Yet Astrid's presence also transformed our cabin from a mere shelter into something approaching a true home, creating schedules that revolved around feeding and sleeping rather than the external demands of weather and season. Her needs provided structure that complemented rather than competed with survival requirements, adding human warmth to spaces that had been defined primarily by functional necessity. The sound of her breathing became a counterpoint to the constant conversation between wind and wood that provided our home's soundtrack. Her small movements and gentle sounds created an atmosphere of life and growth that balanced the harsh realities of frontier existence with hope for the future. Most remarkably, Astrid seemed to adapt to frontier conditions with the resilience that characterized children born into challenging circumstances. She slept peacefully despite the sounds of storms that rattled our cabin walls. She remained healthy despite temperature variations that would have challenged adult constitutions. She developed the quiet alertness that allowed her to observe and learn from her environment without becoming overwhelmed by its demands. By her first spring, Astrid had become fully integrated into the rhythm of our frontier life, travelling with us when necessary, sleeping peacefully during adult work activities, and beginning to show the curiosity and intelligence that would serve her well in an environment where learning and adaptation were essential for survival. The winter of 1873 tested our family with conditions that local Ojibwe described as unusual, even by the standards of their collective memory. Temperatures remained below zero for 6 consecutive weeks. Snow accumulated to depths that made travel impossible without snowshoes. Most seriously, the extreme cold killed several families' livestock, threatening the protein sources that made winter survival possible. I wrote in my journal during this crisis. January 15th. The cold has turned our breath to frost before it leaves our mouths. Little Astrid's face is red despite our constant efforts to keep her warm. Eric speaks of taking the family to Duluth until spring, but the journey itself might kill us, and we have no money for lodging. We stay. We choose to believe that winter will end as it always has. Community cooperation became essential for survival during this prolonged emergency. Families pooled resources, calculating how much fuel and food each household needed to survive until spring. Eric contributed his metalworking skills, helping repair equipment that had failed under the extreme conditions. I shared my knowledge of food preservation, helping process game that hunters managed to take despite the brutal weather. The crisis revealed the extent to which our scattered homesteads had developed into a genuine community. When the Hendersons' roof partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow, Volunteers arrived within hours to make repairs, working in conditions that made outdoor labour a test of endurance. Spring arrived late in 1873, but when it finally came, it brought with it a sense of triumph that transcended mere seasonal change. The sound of running water became a celebration, and the first appearance of green grass felt like a miracle. Our son Gustav was born in the summer of 1874 under circumstances dramatically different from his sister's winter arrival. The cabin windows stood open to catch evening breezes. Wildflowers bloomed in the clearing that surrounded our home. The contrast illustrated how quickly circumstances could change on the frontier, how survival depended on adapting to conditions that shifted from hospitable to hostile with little warning. The rhythm of our days continued to evolve as our family grew, and our homestead developed from survival shelter into something approaching prosperity. Additional land was cleared each year, expanding our cultivation and improving our chances of producing surplus crops that could be sold at the settlement's grain elevator. The cabin received additions: a separate bedroom, a root cellar with improved drainage, a workshop where Eric could pursue his metalwork during winter months. But prosperity on the frontier remained fragile, subject to forces beyond human control. The drought of 1876 taught us harsh lessons about the importance of diversification. I watched weeks of work disappear as plants yellowed and died despite our efforts at irrigation. The experience reinforced my understanding about the danger of depending too heavily on any single strategy for survival. I wrote then. July 20th. The corn is lost and much of the wheat, but the potatoes in the low ground still look promising, and the chickens continue to lay. We have learned to spread our hopes across many possibilities rather than placing them all in one basket. Disappointment, when it comes, hurts less if you have prepared for it. The arrival of railroad service to our region in 1878 transformed the economic possibilities available to frontier families like ours. Crops that once had only local markets could now be shipped to urban centres where they commanded higher prices. Manufactured goods that had been luxury items became accessible to families with cash income from agricultural sales. But the railroad also brought changes that threatened the community bonds that had sustained our scattered homesteads through their most difficult years. New settlers arrived with different expectations, drawn by railroad company advertisements that promised easier prosperity than we original homesteaders had achieved through years of struggle. The intimacy of a community where everyone knew everyone else's struggles and capabilities began to fade as population increased. I adapted to these changes with the same practical wisdom that had guided me through previous challenges, recognizing that progress brought both opportunities and losses. The winter of 1881 brought personal tragedy that tested all my accumulated wisdom about endurance. Eric, working to repair storm damage to our barn roof, fell and broke his leg in a compound fracture that became infected despite all efforts at treatment. The nearest doctor was 3 days' travel away, and by the time medical help arrived, infection had spread beyond treatment. Eric's death on February 14th, 1881, left me a widow at 33, responsible for maintaining a homestead and raising 2 children in circumstances that challenged even intact families. The community rallied to provide assistance, but the practical reality remained that I must master tasks that had always been Eric's responsibility, while continuing to perform the work that had always been mine. I wrote nothing in my journal for 3 weeks after the funeral. When I finally took up my pen again, the entry read simply, March 8th. The children need food, and the animals need tending, and the fields will need planting come spring. Grief is a luxury I cannot afford in unlimited quantities. Eric would understand. Part 3. The Mysterious Amulet. From the Journals of Thomas Brennan, Ranch Hand, October 1887, with additional notes from Dr. Sarah Whitmore's archaeological investigation. Editor's note. The following account was discovered among Thomas Brennan's personal effects, and later corroborated by Dr. Whitmore's official reports. It describes events that occurred on what was once Anna May Larson's homestead, now part of a larger cattle operation. I have been riding fence lines for the McCready Ranch for nigh on 15 years, and in all that time I've seen nothing to match what I discovered this October morning. The frost lay thick on everything, painting the world silver white like some fairy tale my mother used to tell. My horse picked her way careful-like through ground that alternated between hard frozen earth and patches where the season's first snow had begun to gather. The routine never changes much. Follow the boundary lines, check for breaks or damage, make sure the cattle haven't wandered where they shouldn't. It's solitary work that suits my temperament, allows a man to observe the subtle changes that mark the passage of seasons across landscape that's remained largely unchanged since the frontier days ended. But near the ruins of what local folks say was once a root cellar, part of the old Larson homestead from back in the 70s, something caught my eye. Recent rains had washed away some soil, exposing what looked to be a wooden box, just its corners visible above the frost-whitened earth. The wood showed the weathering of decades, maybe longer, but enough structure remained to suggest that whatever lay inside had been protected from the worst effects of time and weather. I dismounted and approached the thing with the care that solitary work in remote places teaches a man. Objects that seem innocent can present unexpected dangers. My leather gloves scraped against the box's surface as I brushed away the accumulated earth, revealing construction techniques that spoke of an era when such containers were built by hand rather than manufactured. The box measured roughly 8 inches square and perhaps 4 deep. Iron hinges, green with age but still functional, held a lid that opened with the resistant creak of metal that hadn't moved for decades. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oiled leather but now resembled parchment, lay something that immediately captured my attention and raised questions I couldn't begin to answer. An amulet it was, clearly enough, appeared to be silver, though tarnish had darkened its surface to the deep grey of storm clouds. The shape suggested deliberate craftsmanship, roughly circular, about 3 inches in diameter, with intricate engravings that created patterns reminiscent of snowflakes or frost formations. Despite the tarnish and passage of time, the detail work remained remarkably clear, each line and curve executed with precision that spoke of considerable skill. What made the discovery truly mysterious wasn't just the amulet's obvious age and craftsmanship, but the circumstances of its burial. The box showed no signs of having been hastily hidden or accidentally lost. Its placement seemed deliberate, positioned with care in a location that would be protected from casual discovery while remaining accessible to someone who knew exactly where to look. I carefully rewrapped the amulet and secured the box for transport, recognizing that I had discovered something requiring expertise beyond my own. The ride back to ranch headquarters passed in contemplative silence, broken only by the soft sound of my horse's breath on frost-hardened ground and the whisper of wind through grass that had begun to turn the pale gold of approaching winter. From Dr. Sarah Whitmore's archaeological report, November 1887, the artifact brought to my attention by Mr. Brennan represents a remarkable example of frontier metalwork, possibly unique in its combination of apparent European craftsmanship and indigenous symbolic elements. Initial assessment confirms his intuition that the find represents something significant, an object that predates most known settlement in the region by several decades. The excavation proceeded with meticulous care. Each shovelful of earth was sifted, examined, and catalogued. The area around the original find was mapped and photographed from multiple angles. Soil samples were collected for analysis. What emerged was not a treasure trove of additional artifacts, but rather evidence that the amulet's burial had been a singular, intentional act. Soil analysis revealed something particularly intriguing. Pollen samples taken from around the box suggest that the burial occurred during late autumn or early winter, when the ground would have been partially frozen but still workable with considerable effort. Chemical analysis of the earth immediately surrounding the container showed trace elements consistent with human activity. Small amounts of ash, organic materials that might once have been food scraps, microscopic fragments of worked metal. These findings suggest that the amulet's burial was not a hasty concealment, but rather a ceremony of some kind. Someone had spent considerable time at this location, possibly conducting rituals or observances that culminated in the careful interment of an object that clearly held significant meaning. The question that haunts the investigation is simple to ask but impossible to answer with certainty. What meaning, and for whom? Examination of the amulet itself reveals craftsmanship that challenges assumptions about frontier metalworking capabilities. The silver content appears remarkably pure, suggesting access to materials and techniques that would have been rare in frontier communities. The engraving work shows a level of detail typically associated with European guild traditions, rather than the pragmatic metalwork that frontier conditions usually demanded. The patterns engraved on the amulet's surface resist easy interpretation. At first glance, they appear to be decorative representations of frost or ice crystals, but closer examination reveals a complexity that suggests symbolic rather than merely ornamental intent. Geometric patterns interweave with organic forms in ways that create optical effects. Depending on the angle of observation and quality of light, different elements of the design seem to emerge and recede. Photography proved challenging. Under ordinary light, the tarnished surface appears uniformly dark, obscuring much of the detail work. But when photographed using specialized lighting techniques, the engravings reveal themselves with startling clarity. The resulting images show patterns within patterns, suggesting layers of meaning intended to be discovered gradually rather than immediately apparent. Consultation with colleagues who specialize in various aspects of frontier history and material culture has revealed intriguing possibilities, but no definitive answers. Metallurgists confirm the silver's purity and reveal trace elements that might indicate its geographic origin. Art historians compare the engraving style to known examples of decorative metalwork from various European traditions. Native American scholars examine the patterns, looking for connections to indigenous symbolic traditions. Some elements of the design echo motifs found in Ojibwe and Dakota winter ceremonies, but other aspects seem to draw from European folk traditions related to seasonal change and protection against harsh weather. The investigation expanded to include local historical records, searching for any mention of unusual metalwork, ceremonial objects, or individuals who might have possessed the skills necessary to create such an artifact. It was in the journal of Father Henri Dubois, a Catholic missionary who travelled through the region in the 1850s, that the first potentially relevant reference appeared. His entry for November 15, 1854, mentions encountering un trappeur canadien français, qui possédait un talisman d'argent gravé de motifs qui évoquent l'hiver éternel. A French-Canadian trapper who possessed a silver talisman engraved with motifs that evoke eternal winter. The journal provides frustratingly little additional detail, but suggests that the trapper regarded the object not as mere decoration, but as functional protection against what he called l'esprit du gel, the spirit of frost. The missionary's account indicates that the trapper spoke of the amulet as protection against conditions that could kill the unprepared, but the journal entry raises more questions than it answers. Who was this trapper? How did he acquire such an object? Why would someone choose to bury it rather than keep it for continued protection, or pass it to descendants? Local folklore, collected through extensive interviews with elderly residents, provides additional layers of mystery rather than clarity, creating a tapestry of stories that seem to point toward the same phenomenon while offering no definitive explanations. Several families preserve stories passed down through generations of unexplained lights, seen on winter nights near the ridge where the amulet was discovered. Not the harsh glare of fire or lantern, but softer illumination that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Martha Henderson, whose family had operated a trading post near the site during the 1870s, recalled her grandmother's stories of travellers who sought shelter during blizzards, specifically in the area around what is now known as the Discovery Site. Grandmother said they called it the warm place, Martha explained during our interview. Even when snow was falling everywhere else, that spot stayed clear. Animals knew about it too. Deer, rabbits, even wolves would gather there during the worst storms. Others tell of travellers who claim certain areas remain mysteriously free of snow even during the worst storms, as if protected by some invisible influence that operates according to rules no one understands but many have observed. Thomas McCarthy, whose Irish family settled in the region during the 1880s, preserved stories that his grandfather had heard from French voyagers who travelled the area decades before permanent settlement. The French fellows called it La Terre Bénie, the blessed ground, Thomas recounted. They said the old trappers knew about places like that, spots where a man could survive when everywhere else meant death. My grandfather always figured it was something the Indians had done, some kind of medicine that lasted longer than the people who made it. The most intriguing folklore comes from Margaret Olsen, whose great-grandmother immigrated from Norway in the 1860s and lived until 1923, providing a direct link to the frontier period. According to family tradition preserved through careful oral transmission, the elder Olsen occasionally spoke of meeting a fur trapper who possessed an amulet that could keep winter's worst anger at bay. Margaret, now 78 years old herself, recalled conversations with her great-grandmother during her own childhood in the 1890s. She described him as a man who seemed older than his years, with eyes that looked like they had seen more winters than any human being should survive. He spoke French and English and several Indian languages, and he wore this silver pendant that caught light in strange ways. The description matches elements of both Father Dubois' journal and the discovered artifact with uncanny precision, but Margaret's account adds details that appear nowhere else in the collected evidence. Great-grandmother said the trapper told her the amulet had been made by someone who understood the secret of making winter kind instead of cruel. He said when his time came, he would bury it where its power could continue to help people, even after he was gone. According to the family story, the trapper visited their homestead several times during the harsh winter of 1856, always appearing during the worst storms when travel should have been impossible. He would arrive when the weather was so bad that even our animals wouldn't go outside, but he never seemed affected by the cold. Great-grandmother said he could walk through snow that would trap other men, and ice that would break under anyone else held his weight without cracking. The Norwegian woman's account includes specific details about the amulet's appearance that correspond closely to the artifact found by Thomas Brennan. She said it was covered with patterns that looked like frost on windows, but when you looked closer, the patterns seemed to move and change. The trapper called it Vintervakt, Winter's Guardian. Most significantly, Margaret's great-grandmother claimed that the trapper spoke of his intention to bury the amulet in a place where its protective influence would continue long after his death. He said winter spirits understood sacrifice and would honor someone who gave up personal protection to help others. Great-grandmother believed he chose the place deliberately, somewhere central to the homesteads that were being established. Additional folklore collected from the local Ojibwe community provides another perspective on the phenomenon, though tribal elders are reluctant to discuss details with outsiders. Joseph Kingbird, who serves as a cultural liaison, offered limited insights while respecting traditional prohibitions about sharing sacred knowledge. Our old people have stories about places where the spirits show kindness to humans who respect the land, he explained carefully. Sometimes when someone does something good, really good, not just for themselves but for people they'll never meet, the spirits remember. The place remembers too. When pressed for more specific information about the discovery site, Kingbird became evasive but offered one additional observation. My grandfather said there were people in the old days who knew how to ask the spirits for protection, not for themselves but for the land and the people who would come after. Maybe that's what happened here. But Margaret's account adds a detail that appears nowhere else in the collected evidence. According to her great-grandmother, the trapper spoke of intending to bury the amulet when Winter's spirit finally claimed him, believing that the object's power would continue to protect the area even after his death. The story suggests that the burial was not concealment but consecration, a deliberate act intended to extend the amulet's protective influence beyond the life of its owner. From Thomas Brennan's continued journal, Winter 1887-1888, Dr. Whitmore's investigation continued through autumn into winter, and I maintained my fence-riding duties throughout the harsh months that followed. December brought the kind of severe weather that would have tested frontier families like the Larson clan, temperatures dropping well below zero, snow accumulating in drifts that transformed the landscape. It was during these harsh conditions that I made an observation that adds another layer to the mystery. The area immediately surrounding the amulet's discovery site remains consistently warmer than adjacent ground. Snow that falls heavily elsewhere accumulates only lightly in a rough circle, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, around the spot where the buried box was found. Ice that forms on nearby puddles and streams remains thin and fragile in this particular location, while freezing solid elsewhere under identical conditions. My observations might be dismissed as coincidence or the result of unknown geological factors, but they align too closely with the folklore accounts to ignore completely. Dr. Whitmore conducted careful temperature measurements throughout the winter, documenting conditions that suggest some form of microclimate effect centered on the discovery site. The measurements revealed temperature differences of several degrees, small in absolute terms but potentially significant for plant and animal survival during extreme weather. Scientific analysis provided no explanation for these temperature variations. Geological surveys revealed no underground springs, no unusual rock formations, no obvious sources of geothermal activity. Soil composition in the affected area proved identical to surrounding ground. By conventional measures, nothing should distinguish this particular location from the landscape around it, yet the effect persisted throughout the winter, creating a small haven of relatively moderate conditions in an area that should experience the same harsh weather as its surroundings. Wild animals seemed to recognize the phenomenon. Deer and smaller mammals were frequently observed sheltering in the protected zone during the worst storms. Even domestic livestock, when given the choice, gravitated toward the area during periods of extreme cold. From Dr. Whitmore's final report, spring 1888, as the investigation approached its first anniversary, I faced the challenge that confronts all researchers who encounter phenomena that resist easy explanation. The evidence clearly documents something unusual occurring at the Amulet's discovery site, but the nature of that something remains elusive. Scientific instruments can measure the effects but cannot identify their cause. The amulet itself continues to yield information while maintaining its essential mystery. Detailed analysis of the engraving patterns reveals mathematical relationships that suggest sophisticated understanding of geometric principles. The spacing and proportioning of design elements follow ratios that appear in various cultural traditions related to seasonal change and astronomical observations, but technical analysis cannot explain why someone with access to such knowledge would choose to create an amulet rather than more conventional forms of seasonal protection. Tools, weapons, or trade goods that would have obvious survival value in frontier conditions. The craftsmanship represents considerable investment of time and skill that could have been applied to purely practical purposes. My final report acknowledges both the significance of the discovery and the limitations of conventional analysis in explaining its implications. The amulet clearly represents a remarkable example of frontier metalwork, possibly unique in its combination of European craftsmanship and indigenous symbolic elements. The circumstances of its discovery and the ongoing environmental effects at the burial site suggest cultural practices that bridge the gap between practical survival techniques and spiritual approaches to environmental challenges. But some aspects of the discovery may remain permanently beyond the reach of academic investigation. The identity of the amulet's creator, the specific circumstances of its burial, and the mechanism by which its presence continues to affect local environmental conditions may represent knowledge that died with the people who possessed it. The amulet now rests in the climate-controlled environment of the university's archaeological collection, available for continued study but removed from the landscape where its influence was most apparent. The site where it was discovered continues to exhibit its mysterious properties, creating a small sanctuary that offers evidence of connections between human intention and natural processes that conventional science struggles to understand. Part 4. The Elite Frontier. From the private correspondence of James Mackenzie, factor of Fort William, Hudson's Bay Company, winter 1847, editor's note. These letters were discovered in the Hudson's Bay Company archives in London. They provide insight into how privilege and power functioned on the frontier, contrasting sharply with the survival-focused existence of homesteading families. My dear brother William, your last letter, arriving with the final supply brigade before winter isolation begins, carries news of London's comforts and conveniences that seem to describe another world entirely. As I write this response by lamplight in my private quarters, surrounded by Persian rugs and heated by fires that burn without the desperate calculation that marks every homesteader's relationship with fuel, I am acutely aware of the contradictions that define my position here at Fort William. You ask about my circumstances. Whether the hardships of frontier life have worn down my spirits or my health, the answer is more complex than your concern anticipates. I live, in many respects, as comfortably as any gentleman in Montreal or Toronto. My rooms are heated by multiple fireplaces that servants maintain at comfortable temperatures throughout even the harshest weather. My table includes items that have travelled thousands of miles to reach me. Coffee from tropical plantations, wine from European vineyards, preserves prepared from fruits that will never grow in this climate. Yet privilege on the frontier remains fundamentally precarious, subject to forces that recognize no human hierarchy. My authority extends only as far as my ability to maintain the complex web of relationships that sustain the company's operations. Indigenous trading partners who regard me as a valuable intermediary could choose to conduct their business elsewhere if my performance fails to meet their expectations. The voyagers whose skills make long-distance transportation possible work for the company by choice rather than compulsion. Their loyalty depends on fair treatment and adequate compensation. The fort itself, for all its apparent solidity, remains a small island of European-style civilization surrounded by wilderness that could reclaim it within a few seasons if human effort failed to maintain its defenses. My office serves as the nerve center for operations that span a territory larger than many European countries. Maps covering the walls show river systems, portage routes, trading posts scattered across distances that require months to traverse. Correspondence from other factors, from company headquarters, and from government officials in distant capitals creates an information network that operates despite conditions that would challenge any communication system. But the maps also reveal the essential isolation that defines my position. The nearest company post of comparable importance lies hundreds of miles away, across country that becomes impassable during the worst winter weather. For months at a time, I make decisions affecting thousands of lives while operating with information that may be weeks or months out of date. The social architecture of Fort William reflects hierarchies transported from European civilization, but functioning according to frontier realities. I occupy the apex of this carefully constructed pyramid, but my position depends on the effective performance of subordinates whose survival skills may exceed my own in many practical areas. Clerks who maintain the post's financial records also serve as interpreters during negotiations with indigenous trading partners, whose languages and cultural expectations they have spent years learning to understand. The cook whose primary responsibility involves food preparation may also serve as our informal medical practitioner, treating injuries and illnesses with knowledge gained through experience rather than formal training. The rhythm of my days begins with reviews of reports from scattered outposts, each document providing a window into conditions and events across territory I may never personally visit. Trade statistics, weather observations, personnel reports, and requests for supplies create a mosaic of information that must be synthesized into decisions affecting resource allocation, personnel assignments, and strategic planning for operations that will unfold over seasons and years. Yet even my privileged position cannot entirely insulate me from the fundamental challenges that winter presents to all human life in this region. The fort's elaborate heating systems require constant attention from workers who must venture outside in deadly weather to gather fuel and maintain equipment. Food preservation relies on techniques that differ in scale, but not in principle from those employed by the most isolated homesteaders. The evening meal in my private dining room represents perhaps the most dramatic contrast with the survival-focused existence of frontier families. The table service includes china imported from English potteries, silver flatware crafted by artisans whose work reflects generations of refined technique, crystal glasses that transform candlelight into prismatic displays. The food itself transcends mere nutrition to become a form of cultural expression. Dishes prepared according to recipes that maintain connections with European culinary traditions, while incorporating ingredients available through the post's extensive trading networks. But even this elaborate meal carries reminders of frontier life's precarious nature. The beef may come from cattle raised at the post's own agricultural operations, but maintaining livestock through prairie winters requires expertise and resources that smaller operations cannot duplicate. The wine may be imported from European vineyards, but transportation costs and logistical challenges make such luxuries extremely expensive and subject to supply interruptions that can last for months. My evening entertainment reflects both the resources available to frontier elite and the limitations imposed by isolation and climate. The parlour contains a piano shipped from Montreal at enormous expense and effort, its presence representing not just musical possibility, but proof of the company's ability to transport civilization's refinements across vast distances and difficult terrain. The library holds books that provide intellectual connection with the broader world of ideas and culture that geographical isolation might otherwise cut off entirely. Yet these refinements serve a population limited to the fort's residents and occasional visitors. The piano's music echoes through rooms occupied by perhaps a dozen people, rather than the concert halls for which such performances might have been intended. My correspondence maintains connections with company headquarters and other posts throughout the network. Writing by lamplight, I compose reports that will be carried by dog sled and canoe across hundreds of miles of wilderness to reach recipients who may not see them for months. These letters represent lifelines to the broader world of corporate hierarchy and commercial relationships that justify my position, but the correspondence also reveals the extent to which even privileged frontier life operates, according to constraints unknown in more settled regions. Decisions that might require quick consultation with superiors in normal business environments must be made independently, with full responsibility for consequences that may not become apparent until months later. Winter nights at Fort William unfold in patterns that reveal both the possibilities and limitations of frontier privilege. My quarters remain comfortably warm through temperatures that would kill unprotected humans within hours, but maintaining that comfort requires the labour of servants and workers who must venture outside in deadly conditions. The building may contain luxuries transported from distant markets, but those luxuries must last until the next supply shipment arrives, which may be delayed by weather or transportation difficulties for unpredictable periods. My bedroom, furnished with items suitable for a wealthy merchant's home in Montreal or London, provides physical comfort that contrasts dramatically with the rope beds and quilted coverings that serve homesteading families. But the psychological challenges of isolation affect privileged and common alike. The sounds that penetrate the fort's walls during winter storms, wind howling across the lake, ice cracking with sounds like artillery, wolves calling from forests that stretch unbroken for hundreds of miles, remind all residents that their comfort depends on maintaining their small outpost of civilization against forces that could overwhelm it if human vigilance ever failed. The social dynamics within the fort create their own forms of tension and cooperation that would be impossible to replicate in more settled circumstances. My authority over company employees operates according to corporate hierarchy, imported from London's boardrooms. but survival in frontier conditions requires forms of mutual dependence that can blur traditional distinctions between superior and subordinate in ways that would be scandalous in civilized society. A clerk whose bookkeeping skills justify his position may also possess hunting abilities that could mean the difference between adequate and inadequate food supplies during emergency situations. The cook whose primary responsibility involves meal preparation may also serve as our informal surgeon, setting bones and treating wounds with expertise gained through necessity rather than formal training. The warehouse supervisor who manages inventory during normal operations may become our military commander if hostile forces threaten the fort. Understanding these complex relationships and managing them effectively requires skills that no amount of education or social position automatically provides. Leadership in frontier conditions demands practical knowledge, physical courage, and psychological insight that university training never addresses. A factor who cannot command genuine respect from subordinates, whose survival skills may exceed his own will, find his authority evaporating during the first serious crisis. I have learned to balance formal hierarchy with informal recognition of expertise, maintaining company discipline while acknowledging that survival often depends on the wisdom and initiative of men whose official positions might suggest limited authority. This delicate balance requires constant attention and adjustment, particularly during the winter months when isolation intensifies every personality conflict and resource shortage. The fort's voyagers represent perhaps the most complex challenge to traditional authority structures. These men, French-Canadian, Métis, and occasionally Scottish, possess skills that make long-distance transportation possible under conditions that would defeat lesser capabilities. They can navigate rivers in flood, portage canoes across miles of wilderness, and maintain schedules despite weather that halts all other forms of commerce. Yet these same men chafe under the routine discipline that fort life requires during winter months. Accustomed to the independence and constant challenge of travel, they find warehouse duties and maintenance tasks frustrating limitations on their abilities. Managing their energy and maintaining their loyalty requires understanding their psychology and providing outlets for their restless spirits. I have instituted winter training programs that allow voyagers to share their wilderness skills with younger employees while maintaining physical conditioning for the demanding travel season ahead. These programs serve multiple purposes. They provide valuable education for inexperienced personnel. They give seasoned voyagers meaningful roles during the inactive season, and they create opportunities for the kind of storytelling and camaraderie that sustain morale during isolation. The storytelling sessions conducted around the fort's central fireplace during evening hours have become unofficial forums for sharing practical knowledge and maintaining connections with the broader network of trading posts, trappers, and indigenous communities that define our operational environment. Veterans share accounts of difficult journeys, successful negotiations, and survival techniques that cannot be learned from manuals or formal instruction. These sessions also serve intelligence-gathering functions, as voyagers report conditions, developments, and changes observed during their travels. Political developments among indigenous communities, movements of competing traders, changes in animal populations, variations in weather patterns. All this information flows through informal conversations that provide intelligence more current and detailed than official reports. The fort's indigenous employees and trading partners require different management approaches entirely. These individuals, primarily Ojibwe and Dakota, possess knowledge and skills that are essential for successful operations, but operate according to cultural expectations that may conflict with company procedures. Negotiating these differences requires cultural sensitivity and diplomatic skills that few company factors develop during their training. Successful relationships with indigenous communities depend on understanding concepts of reciprocity, respect, and mutual obligation that govern traditional interactions. Gift-giving protocols, consultation procedures, and decision-making processes must accommodate indigenous expectations while serving company interests. Failure to navigate these relationships appropriately can result in loss of trading partnerships that have taken years to establish. I have learned to conduct business according to indigenous protocols when dealing with tribal leaders while maintaining company standards for record-keeping and financial accountability. This dual approach requires patience and flexibility, but it has preserved relationships that provide the fort with advantages competitors cannot match. Access to superior furs, reliable transportation assistance, and early warning of political or military developments that could affect our operations. As winter deepens and Fort William settles into patterns that will sustain it through months of isolation, I face the same fundamental challenge that confronts every frontier resident: how to maintain hope, purpose, and human connection in circumstances that test the limits of individual and community endurance. My solutions may be more elaborate and expensive than those available to homesteading families, but they remain solutions to problems that privilege can ameliorate but never entirely eliminate. The contrast between my comfortable quarters and a homesteader's one-room cabin illustrates the range of frontier experience, but both exist within the same larger framework of human vulnerability to natural forces that recognize no social distinctions. In the deep hours of winter nights, when wind howls across Lake Superior with a sound that penetrates even the fort's substantial walls, I may stand before my fireplace and contemplate the delicate balance that sustains my position. My authority depends on the company's continued prosperity, which depends on trade relationships that could shift according to political or economic developments beyond my control. My comfort depends on supply systems that operate across vast distances under conditions that make failure always possible. The questions that occupy my thoughts during these solitary moments might not differ significantly from those that trouble a homesteader during her own midnight vigils. What reserves of strength and determination will be required to survive another day, another week, another season of challenges that test human endurance? How can individual will and community cooperation combine to overcome obstacles that would defeat either alone? What meaning can be found in circumstances that often seem designed to prove human insignificance in the face of natural forces? The privilege I enjoy provides real advantages in the struggle for survival, but those advantages come with responsibilities and vulnerabilities that create their own forms of burden. The frontier experience encompasses a full range of human social and economic relationships, rather than the simplified struggle between individual and nature that popular imagination often suggests. Your affectionate brother, James Mackenzie Factor, Fort William. Epilogue. The continuing story from Anna May Larson's final journal entries 1914-1915. I'm 67 years old as I write these words, and the world has changed in ways that the young woman who stepped off the boat in Duluth could never have imagined. The railroad that arrived in 1878 has brought not just convenient transportation, but entire communities of people who will never know what it means to measure every resource against survival needs. My grandson drives an automobile that can travel in a single day distances that once required weeks of dangerous journey. Electric lights illuminate homes where families once rationed every candle. Central heating systems provide warmth that flows through hidden pipes to arrive wherever human need requires it. Yet I find myself thinking often of those early years, not with nostalgia for hardship endured, but with appreciation for lessons learned that modern comfort cannot teach. When every calorie of food and every moment of warmth must be earned through direct effort, the world becomes immediate and intimate in ways that abundance can obscure. The capacity to find warmth in shared effort when individual resources prove inadequate, the ability to discover beauty in frost patterns on windows when entertainment must be created rather than purchased, the skill of building communities based on mutual necessity rather than casual preference. These remain part of our human inheritance even when modern circumstances do not require their exercise. Thomas Brennan, the ranch hand who discovered the mysterious amulet on what was once my homestead, visited me last month to share news that the temperature anomaly around the burial site continues unchanged. Even in winter's worst storms, that small circle of land remains warmer than its surroundings, creating a sanctuary for wild creatures and a puzzle for scientists who cannot explain what they can clearly measure. The story reminds me that some human intentions create effects that persist beyond individual lifespans, beyond rational calculation, beyond the immediate cause and effect relationships that govern most of our experience. In a world increasingly characterized by rapid change and short-term thinking, the idea that our actions might create beneficial effects lasting for generations offers hope that transcends individual mortality and limitation. I think often of the unknown trapper who, according to the folklore Margaret Olsen shared, deliberately chose to sacrifice his personal protection to create a sanctuary that would help others long after his death. Whether one believes in the supernatural aspects of the story or views the temperature anomaly as an unexplained natural phenomenon, the intention behind the burial speaks to something fundamental about human nature and our capacity for selfless action. The frontier taught all of us lessons about the delicate balance between individual survival and community welfare. Those who focused solely on personal advantage rarely thrived in conditions that required mutual assistance and shared sacrifice. Those who contributed to community welfare, even at personal cost, often found that their generosity was returned in unexpected ways during times of crisis. Eric and I learned this truth repeatedly during our years together. The help we provided to neighbours during their emergencies was returned when we faced our own difficulties. The knowledge we shared freely was supplemented by wisdom others offered when we encountered problems beyond our experience. The community bonds formed through mutual aid created a safety net that proved more reliable than any individual resources. Perhaps this is the real lesson of the protective amulet. Not that supernatural forces intervene to help those who perform good deeds, but that actions taken with genuine concern for others' welfare create lasting benefits that extend far beyond their immediate effects. The kindness we show to strangers, the help we provide to neighbours, the sacrifices we make for future generations may create influences that persist in ways we cannot measure but can sometimes observe. I have seen this principle operating throughout my life on the frontier. Communities that developed strong traditions of mutual assistance weathered crises that destroyed settlements where individuals focused primarily on personal advantage. Families that invested time and effort in helping neighbours found themselves supported during their own times of need. Children who grew up witnessing examples of generosity and cooperation became adults who continued those traditions. The temperature anomaly around the amulet's burial site may represent something beyond current scientific understanding, but it also symbolizes the kind of lasting positive influence that thoughtful human actions can create. Just as that unknown trapper apparently chose to use his protective talisman for the benefit of others, each of us faces daily choices about whether our actions will serve only immediate self-interest or contribute to the welfare of people we may never meet. As I prepare to set down my pen for the final time, I carry with me images that bridge past and present. Hands, my hands, hands of neighbours long dead, hands of children and grandchildren yet to face their own challenges, performing small acts that connect us to the eternal human project of creating warmth and safety in a world that offers both beauty and challenge in measures no individual can fully predict or control. The frost that forms on my windows tonight creates the same delicate patterns that fascinated frontier families during their long winter vigils. But I observe it from behind glass that maintains steady temperature regardless of outside conditions, surrounded by warmth that flows reliably from systems that require no individual tending. In the moments before sleep claims me, I allow myself a quiet moment of gratitude, not just for the immediate comfort of my warm bed and safe shelter, but for the long human story of persistence and adaptation that makes such comfort possible. The families whose struggles I have shared in these pages live on not just in historical records, but in the accumulated knowledge and cooperative systems that transform hard-won survival techniques into reliable comfort. The mystery of the protective amulet, whether understood as supernatural intervention or fortunate coincidence, reminds us that human intention to create beneficial effects for others can sometimes achieve results that exceed the Creator's understanding or lifespan. Our actions, guided by care for others and hope for the future, may contribute to positive outcomes that persist beyond our ability to observe or measure them. The frontier families whose stories fill these journals would marvel at modern comfort, but they would recognize in peaceful rest the fulfillment of their own deepest hopes for the generations that would follow them. Sleep well, inheritors of ancient dreams. Rest peacefully in the warmth that countless hands work to create. The frontier winter ends, as all winters end, in the promise of returning warmth. Our winter evenings end in the gentle arrival of sleep that brings its own form of renewal and prepares us for whatever challenges and opportunities tomorrow may bring. In the space between then and now, between their struggles and our comfort, rest the eternal rhythms of human persistence and the quiet miracle of simply continuing to exist in a world that remains, despite all our achievements, both beautiful and unpredictable. Final entry, March 15th, 1915. The creek runs again. Spring returns as it always has. The long human story continues. The end. Anna May Anderson Larson died peacefully in her sleep on March 20th, 1915, 5 days after her final journal entry. Her detailed records of frontier life, discovered in 1987 along with the mysterious amulet, provide invaluable insight into the daily reality of survival and community building on the American frontier. The temperature anomaly at the amulet's discovery site continues to this day, creating a small sanctuary that offers evidence of connections between human intention and natural processes that conventional science struggles to explain.